Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. Today I've got a review of the AYN Odin 2 for you. I know there's some questions on how to pronounce AYN, whether it's the letters or just AYN, but it's the letters, because it's an acronym that stands for All You Need. You don't have to take my word for it, it's on their Indiegogo page and a few other places. Anyway, this portable Android gaming device has been out for a little while now, and there have been lots of reviews on it, and you may think this one will be exactly the same as all the others. If you think that, well, you're wrong! And no, I'm not going to trash the Odin 2, but I will talk about a few things that I haven't seen in many, if any, other reviews up to this point. My note of disclosure, I bought the Odin 2 with my own money, and AYN doesn't even know who I am, let alone that I'm doing this review. So as usual here, with all my reviews, the opinions are entirely my own, which will become apparent pretty quickly. First up real quick, let's talk about the design and ergonomics of the Odin 2. The system comes in a variety of colors and storage configurations. I've got trusty old black, but let's take a look at some of the other colors here. Now this is a fairly large handheld with a 6-inch 1080p LCD IPS touchscreen. We've got the standard controls you'd expect, a couple of analog sticks, a D-pad, analog triggers, bumpers, face buttons, start and select buttons. In addition, we have back and home buttons for Android navigation on the bottom of the unit. On the back, we have two paddle-style buttons. Also, we've got front-firing speakers.
And there was much rejoicing.
The Odin 2 is probably just a smidge heavier than you'd expect, but it's still pretty comfortable to hold. It does have curved grips on the sides, so you don't need to worry about it feeling too flat or cramping your hands. I do have to admit, however, that the shape should have really jutted out more towards the bottom, forming more of a trapezoidal-like design, which would have felt more comfortable. The angle on the left analog stick and D-pad just aren't quite as comfortable or as natural as I'd like. And the analog sticks are a little bit on the small side, and the face buttons are a smidge smaller than I prefer also. The PlayStation Vita-style D-pad, which is similar to what you'd find on Retroid devices, is pretty good, but it still could have been a little bit better too. There's definite room for improvement here in future Odin devices. The screen is really nice even though it's an LCD and it gets plenty bright. You wouldn't want to use it in direct sunlight or anything, but indoors it's great. The front-firing speakers are nice and clear, but there are a few minor issues here with sound. In the older firmwares, the volume is really quiet at levels 1 through 3, and then jumps super high at volume 4 and above. There's been a firmware update that corrected this issue that was released just last week as I record this, but now there's another small issue, in that volume 1 is louder than it used to be, or should be, so I didn't quite get this right just yet. There are a few extras and other things worth talking about that I'll touch on just briefly here. You can control the LED lights on the analog sticks and the sides of the unit. You can set the color and brightness level or toggle them off completely. Personally, I always keep them off. And you can swap your button setup from Switch to Xbox style, which reverses the X, Y, and AB buttons. In Xbox mode, most emulators will auto-assign the wrong buttons here according to the labels, so you'll have to manually change them in the emulator settings yourself, which is not a big deal, it's just something to be aware of. And I recommend switching to Xbox mode immediately, and just leaving that on permanently for compatibility reasons. Now you can also set the Odin 2 to stop charging the battery after it reaches 100% while it's plugged in, so that you're running off the charger without putting any wear and tear on the battery, which is a huge plus. There are a bunch of other tools you can also access from the settings menus on the device, and there are third-party programs you can install to enable shortcuts in the drag-down menu from the top of the screen. You can also set the fan and performance mode of the system, and I'm not going to talk about every feature here. There are some great guides online, and you can use them to learn how to do all that stuff. Instead, I want to move on and talk about system performance. Alright, so the Odin 2 runs a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 system on a chip, which is often found in phones around the $1,000 range. It's a really powerful ARM chip that can handle almost any application you can throw at it. Almost. What that means in pretty plain English is that you'll be able to emulate basically all the older systems that can work on any modern handheld, meaning PlayStation and below, but in addition to those, you can expect full-speed emulation with no frame skipping and usually with a good degree of increased internal resolution on systems like Sega Saturn, N64, GameCube, Wii, PlayStation 2, PSP, 3DS, and even the Nintendo Switch. Yes, many Switch games run at or very near full speed on the Odin 2. Here's a look at Bloodstained Ritual of the Night running on a system whose name I just can't seem to remember at the moment. Anyway, first things first when it comes to Switch emulation. Obviously, Yuzu is gone, and the recent fork Suyu is also gone now. You can still use those emulators, but there won't be any new versions of either. Another thing about Switch emulation that I'll point out here is that it's not exactly download and go. You'll have to mess around with a lot of different configurations and settings within whichever Switch emulator you choose to run, and certain games require that you download different Adreno graphics drivers to show anything on the screen at all. As long as you don't mind playing around and messing with and tweaking settings, this is all fine, but the Odin 2 is definitely no replacement for a real Switch. So Switch emulation, while it can be awesome on the Odin 2, comes with a few major caveats. First, and I can't stress this enough, don't pirate Switch games. If it's a game you want to play, just buy it. Support the developers and publishers putting out new games that you care enough to spend time playing. Second, there is noticeable input lag while playing Switch games on the Odin 2. No matter which settings you tweak, you won't get rid of it entirely. This is an Android issue, not an Odin 2 issue. I'll go down the line a bit, we have 3DS emulation, which is pretty fantastic on the Odin 2, but with Citra discontinued, you'll have to find either the last version of it, or a fork like Lime 3DS itself recently discontinued, or various other forks of Citra. Once you get it going, though, 3DS is much simpler than the Switch, and most games work just fine, and you can play them at 2, 3, or sometimes even 4 times their normal resolution without any issues. You can also assign the paddles on the back to toggle between various screen configurations. But I will note that, once again, input lag can be a real noticeable issue with 3DS emulation. In most games, it's not hard to naturally adjust to that input lag, but there are some games that require precise timing, like Final Fantasy Theater Rhythm Curtain Call here. And in this game, many of the hardest songs are downright unplayable due to the lag and the speed and precision required to complete them. I can blow through most of these songs just fine on a real actual 3DS, but I don't even get close to finishing some of them on the Odin 2. Again, this is more of an Android problem, not really an Odin 2 problem. Let's talk PlayStation 2. Aether SX2, the main PS2 emulator that was around recently, was, you guessed it, discontinued. There are a few modified versions called Nether SX2 that you can use instead. One is based on an older version of Aether SX2 and one is based on a more recent version. You can only have one of these versions installed at a time. And how do you get them? Well, you can't get them from the Play Store. You have to go to a GitHub page and download some tools to actually build the APK that you then install. While not super complicated, it's not the simplest process there is either. You'll see that after getting things going, performance is great on most games. Again, you can run many games up-resed without any performance hit at all. Oh, and I have an old and a new version? Well, there are a few games that actually perform better in the old version, like Sly Cooper. So you might want to check out which games run best in which version of Nether SX2 before you decide which one to install. Thankfully, things get a lot simpler for the rest of the emulators we'll talk about from this point on. For Dolphin, the Wii and GameCube emulator, the Play Store version pretty much works fine. You may have even heard other reviews say that it runs every GameCube and Wii game just great, but that's not quite the case. I've seen some reviews that claimed even games like Rogue Leader, notoriously difficult to run, work just fine on Dolphin on the Odin 2. And, well, it does, for the first 2 missions. But then you hit Hoth and it runs like this. Now again, this isn't the Odin 2's fault, this is just how Dolphin handles the games right now. And lots of other games do work completely fine and are a joy to play on this handheld device. Here's Wii Xenoblade Chronicles, GameCube F-Zero, and a few other games that are typically tough to get going at full speed on other devices. They're just whizzing right along on the Odin 2. I will note that I couldn't get the Xenoblade 60 frames per second patch to work on the Odin 2, but that might just be a me problem, so I'm not holding that against it. You can also install various other HD texture packs and stuff like that for a lot of these games and still run them at full speed. Now, Saturn emulation, you've got a few options here. Right now, the best is probably the Beetle Saturn core through RetroArch, but there's also Saturn.mu and Yaba Sanshiro, of course. You'll be able to run pretty much all Saturn games on the Odin 2 at full speed with no frame skip. But again, there's a bit of a caveat here. In RetroArch, we can enable run-ahead or preemptive frames to greatly reduce the input lag on the systems in RetroArch that support save states. And in most cases, this works beautifully. But there are some Saturn games that require so much processing power in Beetle Saturn that enabling the input latency reduction options like run-ahead or preemptive frames slows them down to unplayable frame rates. So you're left with the option of using a less accurate emulator like Yaba Sanshiro, or using a more accurate emulator like Beetle Saturn and just dealing with the input delay that comes without run-ahead turned on. Now for Android, I typically recommend Drastic for standard DS emulation. On the Odin 2, you can actually use Melon DS and RetroArch. I tested several games and didn't encounter any speed problems on any of the ones I tried, but obviously I didn't try every single DS game that's out there, so it's possible you might find games that have some issues. Here's the obligatory God of War Chains of Olympus PSP footage in the native PPSSPP app, showing that there's no problems running this game at high resolutions. The Wipeout games used to have speed issues on older hardware, but they obviously run fine here too. PSP isn't the toughest system to emulate even on low to medium powered Android devices these days, but it's great to basically be able to run anything at 4x resolution on the Odin 2 with no compromises. Here's a quick peek at some Vita emulation with Vita 3K, which, if you haven't been paying any attention to this emulator, it's come quite a long way in the last year or so, and it can run quite a lot of games now. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't note here that the battery life in the Odin 2 is absolutely astounding. Even running high-end emulators, you'll get many hours of battery life. With fairly heavy stuff like Wii or 3DS or certain other Nintendo systems, you'll get a good solid 10 plus hours on a charge with screen brightness up just about all the way. With easier to emulate systems that tax the Odin 2's Snapdragon processor less, you'll get upwards of 20 hours. I've had this thing for 3 weeks and have charged it a total of 3 times so far. One note on charging, the $300 unit does not come with an AC adapter, so make sure you've got something that's at least 65 watts around for good quick charging. Alright, so I've mentioned input lag quite a bit already. I was really surprised when I noticed it immediately with my Odin 2, since I hadn't seen anyone really talking about it in other video reviews. I hit up the old interwebs and saw that yes, indeed, other people were experiencing it as well. It can be very noticeable, and while not a fault of the Odin 2 exactly, it's more of an Android thing, it definitely might impact your enjoyment of some games on this system. It really makes me wish there was an option to install a stripped-down version of Linux on the Odin 2. Apparently, some hobbyist developers have been working on porting a version of Linux to the Odin 2 for some time now, and there are progress reports on a few Chinese websites, but I haven't seen any publicly available releases yet. If you yourself are working on that or have any specific details here that you have links to, feel free to leave a comment. And you may think that input lag isn't a problem for you and that you'd never notice it. For some games, you may not. But look at this. This is pretty horrendous. At least in RetroArch you have run-ahead or preemptive frames to compensate. That's not an option for standalone emulators. Also, as I've had the Odin 2 for about 3 weeks as I record this, the back right panel does not feel as solid as it used to, and it actually creaks most of the time when I press it now. I'm hoping it doesn't develop any long-term problems, but I'm not feeling too confident about this thing at the moment. Another issue I've run into is that if I connect the Odin 2 via USB to a PC, after like 15 or 20 minutes, the PC just stops recognizing both the internal storage and the microSD card I got for mine. When I turn off USB storage on the Odin 2 settings and then turn it back on, it fixes the issue for another 15 or 20 minutes, and then it does the same thing again, creating an endless loop. I tried connecting the device to 3 different PCs, and the same thing happened with all 3 of them, and I even used different connection cables to connect the Odin 2 to each respective PC. So definitely not a deal breaker, but it is annoying. It's worth noting in this section that AYN sells 3 versions of the Odin 2 currently. The underlying hardware itself is the same in all 3 versions. They only come with different amounts of RAM and storage. The cheapest option at $300 comes with 8 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of storage space. Personally, I don't think you need the more expensive versions. I haven't even run into Switch games that have RAM issues or anything. I also bought a 512GB microSD card. They're like $28 now for a decent, trustworthy brand. Also, you can allocate 4GB of your internal Odin 2 storage space to work as a swap file, effectively kind of bumping up your RAM a little bit. Alright, let me sum up a little bit of the competition for the Odin 2 here. There are some devices that are cheaper running things like Android or Linux. There are devices like the RG556 from Anbernic or the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. These devices, retail for about half or 2/3 of what the Odin costs, and can run about 80 to 90% of what it does, but they each, have different flaws at different points. And then you have other devices that are a little more expensive, like the Steam Deck. Cheapest version of the Steam Deck is $50 more, but can run a lot of your Steam library, in addition to emulators that are not available on the Odin 2 for things like the Wii U and PS3. And then finally, you've got Windows handhelds that are available, but, for the cheap ones in the $300 to $500 range, they're usually not very good. You have to spend about $700 or more before you start getting ones that are worth it, and at that point, are they really worth it is the question. So let's wrap things up here. In the end, who is the Odin 2 for, and how good is it? Now, I would say that the AYN Odin 2 is ideal for someone who wants to play slightly more modern systems on the go, enjoys tweaking and experimenting with settings, and wants top-of-the-line performance without having to worry about charging their device every few hours. I've been getting 10 to 20 plus hours on a charge, depending on what systems I've been playing on it. And as far as Android gaming devices go right now, yes, this is the king of the hill as I record this review. You can play games from more powerful, more modern systems with ease in most cases, despite a few hiccups that are primarily due to the in-development status of the emulators themselves. Now, I would say it is not for people who are primarily PC gamers that have large Steam libraries. If you've got something like that, Steam Deck is probably a better deal for you, and You know, the cheapest version's only $50 more, even though it's got a lot of features stripped down compared to the Odin 2. And as good as the Odin 2 is, as I've said a few times here, it isn't perfect. I don't consider any of its issues a total deal breaker, but some of them are pretty annoying, the worst being the input delay problem. And to sum up my ergonomics complaints, the angle on the sticks and D-pad especially could be better with a more comfortable shape to the device's grips. I'd also like to see better analog sticks, more like we'd see in full controllers, and larger face buttons. And I'm pretty sure that squeaky right paddle button I mentioned on the back is going to break off any day now. When it comes to value, even though the Odin 2 might seem a smidge pricey at $300 for the base version, you won't find a better Android device right now. Personally, I don't think the more expensive versions are worth it, but if you want more internal space and RAM, don't worry about what I say, just knock yourself out. Get that more expensive version. So for the overall experience it provides, I'm giving the AYN Odin 2 a 9 out of 10. I was really leaning towards 8, because the flaws here I've pointed out are real and can really hamper your experience. But you can do so much with the Odin 2, and it has so many positive points that I feel like dropping it to an 8 would have been a disservice. If you're especially bothered by input delay, then maybe subtract a point from my total score. Now otherwise, you'll have a great time with the Odin 2. I've used this thing a lot during the last few weeks, and I expect I will keep using it for a long time to come, despite my quibbles with it. So, hopefully, you've learned a few things here that you haven't seen before in other reviews. Honestly, it's kinda hard not to love the Odin 2 despite its flaws. This is a premium device, and it looks and feels like it. If AYN can get things together for the eventual successor device and fix the ergonomic issues, and maybe make that next device dual boot Linux and Android, it'll be a force to be reckoned with. But for what we have right now in the Odin 2, we've got a great but flawed device that I think any retro gamer would love to own. So anyway, what do you all think? Do you have an Odin 2? Did this review convince you to either get one or to pass on the system entirely? Are you furious that I didn't mention some specific feature that's very important to you? Tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you won't miss any of my videos. If you want to support the work I do here, you can do that on Patreon or Ko-fi or right here through YouTube channel memberships and things like thanks. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.